Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Day's Digital Festival. This event will begin soon, but first we have a brief housekeeping message. So that you can get the most out of this session, we'd like to point out a few features of Zoom. By clicking on the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom window, you will be able to access the chat room, and if you are in a webinar, you will also be able to make use of the Q&A function. The Q&A function is so that you can ask specific questions of the speaker, which they will be able to answer time allowing at the end of the session. Use the chat room to contribute more generally to the discussion or to share links and resources. When using these features, please mind your P's and Q's. Both will be monitored and recorded. Most sessions will be recorded and uploaded to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival YouTube channel and website. If you're in a meeting, please make sure you keep your microphone on mute unless otherwise directed by the host. If for some reason the session ends unexpectedly or you lose connection, please just click the link again and wait to be let back in. Similarly, if the host loses connection, please bear with us. We will do our best to manage any connection issues as and when they occur, and may contact you by email if necessary. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear about your experience of our digital festival. Fill in our survey to be in with a chance of winning a £100 voucher for a Glasgow local business of your choice. Our survey is available at www.glasgowdoorsopendays.org.uk/survey. Thanks to our supporters, the Arlington Baths Club, Glasgow City Council and the many more, which you can find out about on the partners page of our website. We hope you enjoy this event.
Welcome to today's panel session on community ownership of historic buildings. My name is Andrew McConnell and I'm the Staff Director at Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. We deliver Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival and as part of the National Doors Open Day programme, celebrating heritage and the built environment. It offers free access to over 1,000 venues across the country throughout September every year. The National Festival is coordinated by the Scottish Civic Trust and is part of European Heritage Day. Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival is free to all visitors thanks to the support of our primary funder, Glasgow City Council, and our generous sponsors. Like many charities, we've seen our funding reduced in the last year, so if you'd like to help us keep the event free in future, please consider donating to the Trust. You can do this by texting Doors Open to 70085 to donate £5. Today's event is born out of increasing anxiety amongst communities across the country about the future of historic buildings in their neighbourhoods. Local authorities' rationalisation of services and wider drives towards community empowerment present significant challenges for communities, local authorities, and indeed any organisation responsible for a large property portfolio. And it's a challenge for the historic built environment too. But this isn't a new phenomenon, and there is lots of support and advice available. I'll be joined today by two panellists who will share their experience of projects and working with groups who have or are in the process of saving historic buildings for the benefit of local communities. And I will introduce Sarah and Ailsa in just a minute. But first, a little bit more about Glasgow Building Preservation Trust. We're an independent charity that acts to rescue, repair and restore historic buildings at risk across the city. We work in partnership with community organisations and groups as a sort of charitable property developer. And we'll use our charitable experience, charitable status and extensive experience of developing historic buildings on behalf of community groups to redevelop historic buildings and then pass them on at practical completion to the organisations. And that's when all these wonderful beneficial uses start to happen. We've been going for almost 40 years now, since we started in 1982 as the Bridgegate Trust. And whilst you might not be familiar with our name, I hope that you are indeed familiar with some of our past projects, whether it's Kelvin Grove Bandstand, St Andrews in the Square, Castlemilk Stables, Parkhead School, or indeed the police boxes that you see across the city. Our next project is going to be the West Boat House down in Glasgow Green, where we're currently on site. It's also my pleasure to introduce our other speakers. And next is Sarah Pierce from the Heritage Trust Network. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Andrew. So I'm the Development Officer for Scotland for the Heritage Trust Network, and we are a membership organisation for any community group across the UK who are involved in rescuing a building. So that can be any type of building. It doesn't have to be listed as long as it's traditionally built. We've got over 500 members across the UK now, and 95 of those are in Scotland, and that's my main focus. So really, whatever you're wanting to do with a building, as long as it's not for profit, as long as it's for community benefit, then we're the support here that's available for you. We run events and conferences, but our big focus is peer-to-peer support network. So whatever you're doing, whatever you're working on, someone's done it before and we can put you in touch with them. So you might have a mill building up here. There's a mill building in Cornwall and they've just rescued it and they've found out that really important nugget of information to share with you. So we really like to make sure that everyone feels well supported and not alone. So that's what we do. And you can see our website there to find out a bit more.
Thanks, Sarah. And our third panelist today is Ailsa Mackenzie from the Pyramid in Anderson.
Hi, I'm the Development Officer at the Pyramid. The Pyramid was a Church of Scotland building that looked like it was going to be redeveloped into housing in the local area back in 2014. So a trust came together to save it as a community asset. And since then, we've raised funding to start our first phase of capital redevelopments. We've appointed our first staff members. We have now over 300 members. We serve the local community of G37 and G38 directly, but we also go further than that in Glasgow. So we have quite a lot of work to do to save areas of the building as well. And obviously during the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of community support, but we're very much community directed. Our website's there if you want to have a look and see what we've been up to, and there's a lot more coming down the line as well.
That's great, thanks both. So let's get started. So let's start by talking about the things that can be done before a building becomes vacant and some of the challenges that owners might be facing as they're looking ahead. We always think that it's really important that we should avoid buildings becoming empty at all costs, because stitching time saves nine. And at GBPT, we often say that the best use of a building is that which it was originally designed for. Is it actually the building that needs to adapt and change, or is it perhaps the provision of services that are happening within that? And I wonder, Sarah, if you'd maybe like to comment on that one and say a few words about some of the issues that owners might be facing when they're looking to the long-term futures of the building.
Sure. I think the point about stopping a building from becoming empty is just absolutely crucial. If you're providing a service and maybe you're looking for a new building, or you're aware of buildings nearby in your area that maybe aren't being used at full capacity, starting to be closed, or there's rumours about that, starting up that conversation, that communication in your local area, perhaps chatting with the local authority and saying, what's your plans for this building? What are you thinking of doing here? And actually, maybe you could look at leasing it and just start trying out that building, see whether you could use it and raise some income and give it a go, essentially, before the building is shut down and you have to suddenly think, do we need to buy it and purchase it? It's really trying to get in there preemptively and thinking about whether that's the best building for you. Because as you say, I think there's a certain amount of adaptation that can be done to buildings to make it suitable for your uses, but sometimes spaces really are just not right for what you need, and maybe you need a different building. So it's keeping that balance right so that you're not trying to completely redesign the whole thing, but making sure that a space doesn't become derelict through lack of use. Thanks,
Sarah. And Ailsa, do you think are you able to maybe tell us a little bit more about some of the issues that your project was facing, your building was facing before the project really got going?
So it did look like at one point that the building would just be closed and sold off. But as you said, it was about the original design of the building, and the building had been designed with a lot of community space as well as space for the church. And that was why it became so well used in the community, and why there was a very clear use and reason to keep it there. It also had some tenants in situ as well, which weren't the original use of the building. The tenants had come in and started using areas that had actually been on-site accommodation and classrooms. But it meant that we could see a viable business was already there, where there was, kind of a good level of tenant income to sustain the building, plus a lot of space that could be hired out and used by the local community. So we didn't have to go through any kind of hostile takeover, or the church was quite happy to sell it to us at the point where we wanted to buy it and had raised the funds to do so. But we did actually have to look at how the building was being used, because some of the things we did inherit from the church were no longer compatible with our purpose as a community organisation.
There's a couple of really interesting points in there. I think I'd maybe just like to dwell a little bit more on that point that the church were happy to sell to the community organisations or to the tenants group that were emerging. And quite often we see that with local authorities, that they do want the beneficial uses to continue, and where a viable proposition is emerging, they want to be supportive in facilitating that. It's one where I remember we've got one project on site actually, so the boathouse in Glasgow Green, where back in the 90s, one of the organisations down there was looking at taking more responsibility for that building, and at the time, the owner, the local authority, wasn't interested in either providing a long lease or ownership, because at the time the culture was for the local authority to retain all of their property interests. But the situation changes, and quite often that perception that because you've been given an answer 5 or 10 years ago that will still be the same, it doesn't necessarily always apply. The other thing that is probably worth dwelling on whilst we're talking about issues before buildings become vacant is some of the challenges that property owners will face. And we've had a bit of experience about this as well in some of the properties that we've owned. Whilst we may be charities, we shouldn't be seen to be, or we shouldn't be charitable in some of the activities that we are doing, because property is a commercial world in many sense. And even community centres need to generate sufficient income to afford the management and maintenance of that building and to invest in the future. And quite often, early intervention is best, both for maintenance issues. So if you've got leaking gutters, for example, you want to intervene quite early. Also in management, where perhaps rents are missed or higher fees are missed. It's important to try and generate and secure as much of that income as possible. So when a large owner or an owner of a large portfolio of properties is looking at addressing, potentially disposing of properties, it's probably worth thinking, well, what are the motivations behind that? And I think Sarah's point earlier on about communication with the owners to try and understand what those motivations are is really important.
Yeah, I think you have to understand that quite often if a local authority is selling off a building, it's because they haven't found it easy to make income from it. And actually, so often the ideas that come from the community might be a better use, but you really want to explore those before you fully take responsibility for that building. And also the use doesn't have to be set in stone. It might change in 5 years' time. But it's definitely worth exploring at the beginning, I think.
Absolutely. So let's maybe move on now to the sort of situation where it's becoming apparent that a building is about to become vacant, a building within a local community is about to become vacant. And I think we've all been in that situation where we've either thought or said, but certainly heard the phrase, oh, somebody should do something about that. And quite often when we hear that, it's really somebody else. It's the title of today's event. So I wonder, Ailsa, maybe if you want to tell us a little bit more about the sort of inception of the project that you're working on, when the organisations first heard that the building might being made redundant.
I think they had skin in the game, to be honest with it, because they, you know, the original trustees were drawn from people who'd been involved with the church. So they had seen some of the community activity that had been happening for years in the church and didn't want to see that go. And then some of the trustees were also tenants and they didn't want to lose their home. They didn't want to lose their offices. So I don't think there was ever a point where it was someone should do something about this. It was we should do something about this. And I think that is what's driven the project, you know, both the love for the building as the building is, you know, kind of this amazing mid-century brutalist building that really does have a good reason to preserve it, but also just everything that was happening in there and a desire to be that and being rooted in the community as well. So some of our board, they're very close to the pyramid and definitely live in the area. And it was trying to bring like-minded people like that onto the board and as volunteers and to serve on committees and things. So, and it was, you know, lots of people in the area have good memories of being in the building, doing things from being kids, sort of kids groups and stuff, and even getting married in the building, you know, so it was home to a lot of celebrations in the past.
I think that really touches on the kind of collaboration and partnership element, is that actually within your community, you may have a few folk who are already using it, but what about everyone else? There are other groups out there and other people who might need a space, or you know, they want to explore some ideas. There might be new businesses that need startups, or maybe different faith groups who are interested in worshipping in a, you know, different space. There's lots of people out there to communicate with. And also when it comes to volunteers and support and help and maybe new trustees, you've no idea who else is out there. So it's really worth exploring and promoting, advertising locally to say, this is our building, this is everyone's building, and you can take ownership too. And actually, what do you want to do with this space? Because usually there's room for everyone.
One of the issues that we quite often deal with inquiries is an expectation that historic buildings, simply by virtue of them being listed, you know, will attract grant funding for their repair or for their reuse. But that isn't always the case. And I'm sure, Sarah, you've maybe had more than your fair share of those type of discussions, where, you know, people's expectations of grant support, as if by virtue of it being a historic building, they're owed that this building is saved for their use.
Yeah, I think, you know, over the last 10 years or so, the focus has changed entirely. So the idea of saving a building just because it's architecturally special or something historic happened there, it's almost gone entirely. And the funders that you speak to these days, they really want to know who you're benefiting, whose lives are you improving locally. And it's great that you're saving that building, because let's face it, it looks fantastic in the streetscape and it definitely improves the area. But your main focus has to be, what community activities are we doing here? What services are we providing? How are we improving people's lives? Because the building loan won't do it. So a lot of the funders, they really want to know, why now? Why do we need to do this now? And, you know, so what? Why? Yes, it's a historic building. So what? Whereas if you can say, well, do you know what? This is the only space nearby that we can run this community creche that's affordable for these families. And also we provide an employability club for young people who are struggling to find work, and these startup businesses they don't have anywhere else nearby that's affordable. So we need some money to repair the roof. You know, if you say, please give us money to repair the roof, they're going to go, right, that's lovely, but actually this group down the road have got this amazing building in there teaching traditional craft skills or something. You've got to have that reason behind it. And let's face it, isn't that better? Doesn't that benefit everyone a bit more?
Yeah. And maybe just to come back to you, Ailsa, I think what's happening out at Anderston is a really good example of that needs first approach. You know, you've talked already about how the community organisations have identified the need for spaces to deliver some of those activities. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about the sort of the viability of those uses and how that was tested and how that's evolved?
I think, you know, we could see that the building was still in use, and pre-pandemic, we had around 1,200 visits a week of just people coming in at all hours because it's such a massive space. I think there are some difficult decisions to be made in future about the use of the building, and even from some of the people who saved the building in a way and came together to form that trust, because they're not necessarily covered by our constitution anymore. You know, they're not part of the local community. So we need to be looking at saying, actually, you know, does having a tenant that we inherited from the Church of Scotland serve our community? Or are we better using the space that they're using for micro businesses or studio space? And I think there's also ways that we can look at how we have big ticket events, for example, in there, because we have this huge space that was the original church in the pyramid. And now that can be used for a whole range of secular celebrations and meetings and everything. And we've even got space that's used quite a lot for film and TV production, you know, and that's something that can bring us in quite a lot of income very quickly, which then allows us to do the community stuff, which is what we're always looking at. So we almost have a gateway process of going, is this by the community that they want to do in their building? Is it something for the community that they want to engage with, or that we're supporting them and working with them? Or is it going to benefit them in a different way by bringing wealth into the area and into the building so we can do more of what we do with the community? And I think that's almost a, you know, it's a simple way for us to do a bit of a sense check on things that come in. So that works quite well for us. I mean, we see that, you know, business planning has been massively important in getting funders on board. And when they see that we can say, okay, so we're doing all this fantastic community stuff, but we're actually quite hard-nosed about how we bring our income in. And we will charge high prices for people who aren't in the community and people who have the money to come in and do things.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. The other thing that I think you guys have been quite effective at is that transition, because it's not a lot of the projects that GBPT delivers. You know, the buildings are in much worse condition. You know, they are pretty much abandoned when we take an interest, and there's a gap between whatever activities an organisation might be doing. We'll be doing the capital works, and then, you know, the organisation steps into a complete building at the end. But what you guys have been able to achieve is that successful transition from, you know, fully church use to fully community use. I'm sure that must have brought its own issues, though.
Yeah, it wasn't as easy as A to B. There were some issues because the great thing about the pyramid was that people had a sense of ownership of it and felt they belonged to it, but that also caused us some issues. So we had to give notice to some of the faith-based groups who were using the building a lot over the weekend, using the entire building. So that excluded the community from using their own space. So that was quite a difficult time to go through. I think also about how we use the space as well. So, for example, going back to the main church part, which is the pyramid bit of the building, it doesn't have any heating at the moment. So it's usable during the summer, but completely unusable during the winter. And we started looking at how we could do different things. So we actually put a yurt cinema in the first Christmas we were in there, you know, so we could actually do something, but that would never have been able to happen when it was a church. And I think it was quite a surprise for people to see something like that and really turn the use of that building into something else, that area in the building.
And that's also demonstrating to potential future funders that there is a viable use, that you've got a community engaged, several communities engaged, and are supportive. That's a really important part of the process, isn't it, Sarah? Being able to demonstrate that need and that support. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about some of the meanwhile uses that some of your members might be undertaking, and how they can demonstrate to funders that there is a need for what they're proposing to do?
Sure, I think it's so important to try a few things out. I mean, it's certainly when you're talking about cinemas and yurts and things, makes me think of the helter skelter they put in Norwich Cathedral. really it's about being open-minded and flexible. And that particularly, again, if you're bringing new folk onto your trustee board, that can be a really good way to get some new ideas on, because it's just worth trying out anything really and seeing if it works. I was talking to a group recently who was saying that, yeah, the roof needed repairs, they've got some leaks coming in, and we were looking at it and just saying, well, right, that is a priority, absolutely, for the future, but your buckets are fine for now and it's holding the drips and it's not in a crisis mode. So if you actually try out some different activities, you know, it was a small community heritage museum, and it was saying what we need to do is get the local community to view this as a space for everyone. So yes, it's for visitors and it's for tourists to the area, but actually this is a community building. What else can people be using this for? Could we have birthday parties in here for people who want it? Could we do kids activities at the weekend? And actually, if you try those out and kind of discover what's successful and what the community needs, if you ask the community what they need in a survey, then when it comes to actually further down the line saying to the funders, we need money for the roof, you can say, because we've done these activities, but we'd love to do more. You know, we've done a bit of an oral history project nearby, but actually we realized this could be a whole display of heritage kind of say around the walls whilst it's still a community space. I mean, we've got churches, obviously a particular one. You've got a fantastic, more kind of modernist style building at the Pyramid, but the traditional churches, a lot of them that we're working with still have all the pews in. And obviously that can be very controversial for some. But removing some of the pews, we had a group talking recently about putting in a badminton court. Well, putting badminton into your church isn't going to stop it from being used for worship sometimes on a Sunday, or being used for yoga during the week, or a kids class. Really, it's worth trying out anything, and nothing is set in stone. Particularly this last year or so, we've seen about the flexibility, how important it is for the future to say, we were going to do a co-working space in here, but because of lockdown that didn't work, and actually could we do remote talks instead because the acoustics are great. So yeah, there's really, sky's the limit, I think, sometimes.
I suppose the key point there is whoever is responsible for the building needs to be able to see where those local needs are and what the needs of the building are. So we, one of the key conditions of us going into a partnership project is knowing that our partner organisation has got the capacity to take responsibility for the building at the end, both in terms of its maintenance and management, but also to deliver on those beneficial uses, to recognise that we need to reach out and get as many different groups in there using that building as possible. And it must be really difficult for the large sort of property portfolio managers to recognise, identify and address the needs of each and every building that they're facing. Also, the sort of skill sets around taking responsibility for a building are quite diverse, they're quite varied. Is that something that has taken your group by surprise, or was that something that you think the folks were fairly well prepared for? that merged transition?
I don't think it's entirely by surprise, but I think there are things that have happened and things that will happen in the future that hadn't been considered by the people who set up the trust originally. I'm trying to think of an example. I think even capital works, kind of, and the processes that you go through, because it's not just as easy as getting the money and then starting it. It's a whole process of tendering, contracting, getting planning permission, kind of going through quite a long process. So, I mean, it's taken 2 years for us to get to the point where we're going to start our very first capital works on site. And I think that is a bit longer than the trustees may have hoped for in the beginning. And this is just the first part of a story as well. This is going to go on for years, I think, the capital works, because the other thing we did was to break down the capital works into phases rather than close the building, because we didn't want to close down and stop serving the community and stop serving the tenants that were making the building a success. So we're able to keep quite a big chunk of the building open and carry on our work, because as well as, we've already mentioned that we don't want to close down a building completely and then go back into it and find another use for it. But closing a building down during works is not necessarily the best way to go either, especially when you've got a big estate like we do.
Yeah, I think also it's important to help groups to become aware of the support that is available. And I mean, that's why Heritage Trust Network exists, is that there is support out there. Funding is not always the easiest thing to come by, but the Architectural Heritage Fund will fund business planning and feasibility studies to explore, is this the right building? Is this the right use? DTAS, Development Trust Association Scotland, they have their community ownership support service, which helps you go through that asset transfer purchase process if you're going to take ownership of the building. That support's there. We can connect you with anyone, and also a lot of groups, you know, looking at the option of working with someone like Glasgow Historic Buildings Trust, Building Preservation Trust, too many acronyms, Glasgow BPT. Working with the Building Preservation Trust as a community group might be the best route. So you as a group of volunteers and trustees absolutely need to get a full grasp of what this project entails and what you are taking on. It's a big commitment. And in the future, you want to refresh and bring new people on board so that those who've been doing it for the last 10 years can take a break. But maybe working with a professional trust would be the best route, so that then you are the end user and they're the experts at doing the capital works. But I think talking of phasing approaches, that's absolutely something that's being encouraged by the funders at the moment. Instead of going for whopping great amounts of money and shutting everything down and doing a whole redoing process, you know, taking it chunk by chunk and trialing it out and seeing what uses, because it's amazing how often, you know, you do phase 1 or 2 and then actually maybe phase 3 never happens because what you've got is great and it's working. Or you change things as you go along because your uses change.
Yeah, those different stages of the project are really, it's a really important point for communities to bear in mind, particularly if a project is born out of, you know, an external threat, you know, that this building might be closed or this library service might stop, because the needs to move that project forward are varied. And there's we also talked about, you know, some of the expectations around the timescale. Even fast moving projects for us don't move particularly fast, and we've done it before. You know, the West Boathouse, we were doing a feasibility study down there in 2002, and then subsequently in 2015. But it's always important to recognise that, you know, the needs of your organisation will change too. So we quite often talk about the success and the struggles of Govan Hill Bats, which of course, many folks will know, that started out as a protest about the council closing a community facility, the public baths there, and that became a campaign, and there was different skill sets required to develop our project, and then there are different skill sets required again to deliver that project, and then there'll be different skill sets again to run that completed facility. And it's absolutely amazing what that organisation has been able to do over and to sustain that energy and enthusiasm for such a long time. And it's maybe unrealistic to expect that to happen all across the country. You know, that requires a lot of upskilling and a lot of capacity building, which a lot of the time it's a huge responsibility to put onto community organisations. And I suppose that's why, or that's where the Pyramid at Anderson are so fortunate in being able to sort of build that capacity by engaging folks like yourself, Ailsa, to support them through those works.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you've just, as you said, you've just got to be ready to change, not necessarily very quickly, but I think be flexible about the way that you're working, and you know, kind of look at how the building is being used and what it's needed for. And I think, you know, we were fortunate in that when the pandemic struck, the way that we were set up, we could react to that. And I think, you know, we don't know what's going to come down the line next, but if we are flexible in our overall approach, hopefully we will be able to react to whatever is going to happen next, whether that's a good or a bad thing, and be able to make the most out of it for the community and for the building.
Thanks, Ailsa. So the next sort of section that we've got planned here in our discussion is around that viability. Can it be done? Can communities take responsibility for these buildings? And we've touched on the different process about building a campaign and identifying different uses and viability. Sarah, I'm going to turn to you just to maybe talk about talk a little bit more about some of the support that is available to organisations at each stage of their project.
Sure. I mean, Heritage Trust Network, as I said, we're peer-to-peer support network. We have a huge online digital resource that covers just every stage of a project. So that could be getting a group of the community together, becoming trustees, becoming constituted, figuring out what to do with your building, all the way through to capital works and then managing it in the long term. So we've got all these resources all in one place to help support that. But with that, at every stage, we can connect you with folk and connect you with different organisations. And there is support out there. I think sometimes it can just feel really overwhelming as to where do you go. We've got a building that's got an industrial history. Who do we talk to at Historic Environment Scotland about that? Well, there is a person, and we can put you in touch with them. I think obviously there are other funders out there, and I think Historic Environment Scotland, with their funds, particularly to repair historic buildings, they're pretty much the only funder who do that. Repair a building just because it's architecturally important. The Architectural Heritage Fund are fantastic, and of course the lottery are very helpful. I think one thing to keep in mind about funders like the National Lottery is that a lot of people have in mind that they are the funder to go to with a £3 million project. So that's where that breaking it down into phases and into chunks comes in, so that actually if you're putting in for maybe £250,000 or £500,000 for this phase, then it's a bit more likely to happen. But there are organisations out there. The Scottish Civic Trust have a My Place mentoring project at the moment, which is a bit more hand-holding support. So for groups who are at the very, very early stages of taking on a historic building and wanting to do something with it, there is focused support. So I would say, I mean, not to make this a pitch for us, but absolutely get in touch with Heritage Trust Network so that we can discuss your needs and then connect you with others. I know, particularly post-pandemic, Museums and Galleries Scotland at the moment, they've got a bit of a hand-holding mentoring program that's available for small community museums who need some help. We're working on a campaign called Make Your Mark, which is about getting new volunteers and more diverse volunteers into heritage. And it's about almost scrapping that word heritage and just saying, look, this is just an interesting local place and it's your place. And we'd love you to be a part of this. And this is not about a certain type of person from a certain type of background getting to enjoy this building and no one else. It's about everyone, and we want everyone to be part of that. So Make Your Mark campaign is another thing to look up that I'll put in the chat box.
The next thing I think is probably quite interesting to talk about is, if I come back to the context that we're having this event, in Glasgow, for example, there's an initiative by the local authority called People Make Glasgow Communities programme, and that's encouraging community organisations to submit an expression of interest in terms of taking more responsibility for some of the assets which the local authority owns. There are no shortage of historic buildings at risk across the country. What we do have a shortage of are organisations with the capacity to take responsibility for those historic buildings. So I wonder if anybody's got any sort of comments on feel free to add stuff into the chat box for those that are attending, on what they sort of think about that initiative, if people are familiar with the People Make Glasgow Communities programme. I think it's actually, it's a really interesting proposition that it is trying to get upstream of what is an impending issue for a lot of local authorities. And I like to think that it's going to lead to a lot of constructive discussions with community organisations in advance of any buildings perhaps becoming surplus to the council's requirements. But already I think the example that Ailsa's been describing at the Pyramid is a really good model for others to follow, where the tenants' organisation is in discussion with the owner about how those uses can be sustained and adapted and evolved. Now, obviously, the Church of Scotland isn't the local authority, and circumstances change elsewhere, but I think it is a really interesting model that other organisations could follow.
Yeah, I think feedback is really important in lots of ways. So actually negative feedback as well. If you're seeing like the projects that Glasgow City Council are doing now, saying, do you want to take on these buildings? There's some support here. Any feedback is valuable. And actually, if you're saying, no, that's too much and that's not possible, or we would need this to make that happen, we would need this support in place to make that happen, let them know. And feedback to organisations like ourselves, and we'll pass that on to the funders. We're always in discussion with funders and members from all over the place. But I think it's a really exciting opportunity, particularly for, it's for everyone. I was going to say for high streets and for town centres and regenerating those spaces, but then it's exactly the same in rural areas as well, and small communities. We all know that particularly these larger buildings that used to have a civic function, sitting there empty on the street doesn't do anyone any good walking past them. And it's the same for bringing visitors or new people into your area. There's nothing like reimagining those spaces. I was just thinking of a member of ours in Wales called Circus Eruption, and they're a circus group who are in a church building, and they particularly work with people who've got mental health challenges and a number of different problems, and the results are just unbelievable. They just do everything through the medium of circus skills, which is just wonderful. You may not have thought of that, but maybe there is a circus group who is growing up in your area who's looking for a new building. It really could be anyone. So I think that's the thing to keep in mind.
Ailsa, do you have any sort of comments on that? You'll be aware, working with lots of different community organisations, of some of the anxieties that they have around facilities that they're currently utilising.
Yeah, I think you have a lot of goodwill around facilities sometimes, I think, and people want to save them, but I think everyone really has to consider their capacity to do that very seriously, because the work really starts when you get your hands on the building. It's not actually getting it into the ownership of a trust or a long lease or whatever, kind of whatever Glasgow Council are going to do with those buildings. And I think, the business planning and the preparation and the community consultation are all absolutely essential to that, because do you know what? It's okay to say, this isn't for us right now. It might be for somebody else as well. And I think, you need a lot of honesty with your group and taking that forward.
Absolutely. I think we've been reflecting on those early stage moves in project development, where maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the focus will have been on the physical viability of restoring a building. And I think now the focus is actually on, well, what are the beneficial uses that are going to be provided? But seemingly more importantly, it's, how viable is it? What is your outline business case? How does this stack up? How are you going to be able to manage this more responsibly than the existing owner? What's different? So, some of those very frank questions that Sarah pitched earlier on about, why now and so what? It's really important that you've got that beneficial use clearly highlighted, and the financial viability supporting that.
Yeah, and I think recognizing where you need to stop sometimes and bring somebody else in, because I think it's great when you have a volunteer board or trustees getting together to progress a project like this, but it's a volunteer board, it's not their full-time job. So I think it's recognizing that you will need to bring some expertise in somehow further down the line.
Yeah. Sarah, do you have anything to add on that one?
I think, yeah, the only thing I was just thinking about that is sometimes you can just kind of tide over a building. maybe by trialing it and taking a lease and using it for a bit, actually, as we're saying, things change and it absolutely might not be the right building for you. And it's something we discuss a lot of, when is the time to walk away? Well, actually, maybe you took it on for a few years and found out it wasn't the right building for you. But in that time, you kept the lights on, you kept the heating on, you gave it a go, and maybe you publicized the building a bit. Well, you never know what that might lead to. So none of it is a failure. Nothing there has done any harm. You've just kept it going for a bit longer. And I mean, we've got so many examples of projects, as Andrew was saying, that timeline, it can be 5, 10, 15, 20 years easily, but then something else might have come along. So it's certainly, you haven't done any harm if after a while, as a community group, you're walking away and looking for a different building because you've just kept it going that bit longer. And if you've been in the building, you've maybe seen the leaks that have come through on the ceiling, and therefore someone's been able to do some repairs, opposed to it being closed and not used at all. It's still been a beneficial effect, really.
That's maybe one for Ailsa now to comment on. Do you feel that the initial vision for what the future capital project might have been has perhaps evolved now that you've got a better understanding of how you use that building?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I think we're still changing it, actually. I couldn't tell you what it's going to look like in 5 years' time inside. I think, it's not just a one and done with consultation, and it's something that we're asking ourselves and the community all the time, because we're seeing our community change. We're seeing the makeup change, we're seeing the numbers change, we're seeing the demographics change, and we're seeing their needs changing as well. And if we can respond to that and work with them to give them, the building that they deserve as a community, it might not be what we thought 5 years ago. It might not be, the architect's plans from a couple of years ago. So by doing the work in phases, we've almost built in that flexibility to where we're going to be. And I think, we're lucky to have a building that's got so many spaces and is so adaptable and has a big population around it and is close to Glasgow city centre. So, sometimes the stars do align on a project, and I think that's definitely happened on the Pyramid. But we still face the same challenges. We still have to think about, is this what we think the community wants, or is it what the community wants? And we still have to keep on asking those questions.
Well, I think that's a really nice place to maybe bring our discussion towards a close. I don't see any questions in the chat box or the question Q&A box, so feel free for those watching in to fire in some questions. And I wonder, maybe Sarah and Ailsa, whether you've got any questions for each other about your project or the different experiences that you've had. Or maybe, so actually maybe the other option there is, Ailsa, the way you guys have delivered that, or in the process of delivering that project, is really quite different from how we go about doing our projects. Is it something that you were necessarily aware of, that you've already talked about the phasing of the project? Do you feel as if there's enough support out there? There are enough organisations providing support and advice to ensure that nobody's actually on their own in this, that somebody has done this before?
I think there is. I think finding them can be quite difficult, especially if you've never done anything like this before. Sometimes it feels there's too many. and I'm thinking specifically about, we are trying to look at how we reduce our carbon in the building, and there are so many different organizations who can help us do that, and I'm still not sure which the right one is to go to. So it can be quite a time-consuming thing to find out the right people to talk to about your project. So I think working with someone like Sarah, who can almost shortcut you into people who are really going to be helpful, is good. And I think, there's two sides to it, isn't it? Because it's, we are taking knowledge and expertise from other people, but we're going through the process and we're happy to share it with other people now too. And I think it's a good culture of being open with people as well, and sharing what worked and what didn't work, and hopefully making it a bit more streamlined for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's certainly our goal. I always kind of think of groups starting with a blank piece of paper. You just think you don't need to do that. Somebody's just drawn up that job description or done that application, and actually someone could just let you see it. And I think certainly we get a lot of feedback of groups just saying, of course, I'm so happy to chat to that group or go on a visit and discuss what we did, because actually when I was having a crisis last year, someone really held my hand through that who'd done it before, and that was so helpful. I can see this question that's come into the chat box now about creative way that groups have fundraised for a building. And there's a number of different options for raising that funding, particularly the match funding with the bigger funders. So things like crowdfunding is obviously quite popular at the moment, and one of the best things that we hear about crowdfunding is that it's just really great publicity for your project. So actually, whether or not you manage to raise the £100,000 that you hope to, because they're quite often very attractive and appealing, and they encourage you to make kind of short videos and then share it as far as wide and kind of well beyond your community. Crowdfunding can sometimes just be a really great way to kind of raise the profile of what you're doing, and then you never know who that might reach. Community shares Scotland can be very helpful for helping to purchase buildings. I know people like the Rockfield Centre in Oban did community shares, and those can be from as small as £25 for people within your area, or it can be further flung people as well, and that can be a really good way to raise money. Of course, there's the classic, sponsor a slate, sponsor a brick, all of that kind of stuff. I know up in Lossiemouth, where just down the road from me, they're rebuilding a bridge over to the beach, which famously was condemned a couple of years ago and now stops people from reaching their beach without a swim. One of the things they're doing now is they did secure some funding for a new bridge, but they're currently selling off every plank from the original bridge for people to have, because it is a piece of their community heritage, and actually they weren't going to do anything with it anyway. So there's always those ideas. People do get really creative, so you can obviously do lots of sponsored this and sponsored that, but I think again what the funders really like to see is if you say we did this activity, we did this crowdfunding, and out of the local community 75 people have actually donated, and no, it's not raised millions, but that just shows you all of these people are on board. And as I say, you never know quite who you're going to reach and who you're going to come across, and it's not something to bank on, but the odd bequest does sometimes appear, so you can always keep your fingers crossed for that. But yeah, there are a number of different creative ideas out there, and you can always email me and I can think of some more examples.
I think that your point there about the campaign around crowdfunding is really important, because there's two sides to that. One is the funding that is achieved, but three sides, and another is having all those extra supporters. But it's also about evidencing to your wider funders that you've got that support, and then with that support, the people that are most likely to support you in the future are the ones that are already aware of what you do, like what you do, and have supported you in the past. So it shouldn't just be seen as a crowdfunding campaign at that particular time. It's something that's going to be of use to you both in delivery of the project and later on in use of the building. We have got another question coming in. Just reading it as I'm talking, which isn't a sensible thing to do.
Well, you do that, Andrew, because I was just thinking of something else. Another thing to make is the point about fundraising. I think Scotland's Towns Partnerships produce the funding finder, as they call it, and it's so helpful. And I have to say, I point people to that a great amount, just because it's all the funders kind of currently open in Scotland, including new ones, and they tell you the deadlines, and they've got a theme around kind of regeneration, historic buildings, but also environmental impact, and they've got town centres, everything. So the funding finder document, I can get the link and share that. That's really worthwhile looking at. Things like Obviously renewables, there can be money if there's a wind farm near you. Landfill money, I'm hearing from quite a few folk, if you're in 15 miles of landfill site, which most people are, they've been really helpful in the past for repairs to buildings and things. So they're worth chatting. There's lots of little smaller pots of money out there. And actually, usually the smaller the amount of money that you go for, the fewer hoops there are to jump through. And some of them you just need to send a very nice letter saying thanks very much, which sometimes is really what you want, opposed to then providing a huge evaluation form at the end.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one, and actually the potential knockback, which we all get when we're fundraising for our projects, isn't always a bad thing. We had a couple of knockbacks on the Boathouse project early on, and that actually helped shape and refine the development of that project and made it a much stronger project when we went back in. There's a question there about evidencing community engagement before going for the big bucks. And I suppose that my query around that is how big are we talking in terms of big bucks? And without getting a specific answer there, our approach tends to be evidencing sufficient support. Oh, 3 million, here we go. Evidencing that local support, evidencing that actually people have got, as Ailsa mentioned earlier, skin in the game. You know, they've got an interest, and they may have monetized that support in some way. Then you may be able to evidence either a crowdfunder or numerous donations. And you want to have demonstrated, I think, targeting those small funds that Sarah was talking about in the first case, and being realistic about the timescale of when you're going to achieve delivery. Because it is better to, I think, have approached and maybe secured 5-6 dozen smallish funds before you go in with a big, for example, a lottery application. I think the trajectory of funding is changing. Of course, it's always changing. In Glasgow, because of the size of the city, there used to be a lot of landfill funding that we could secure through the local authority. That used to be up to maybe 2/3 of the cost of a project, and that is now way down just by the change as a result of the changes in landfill funding. So it's not the biggest portion of our project funding anymore. Local authorities' contributions to projects, that's down as well, and just reflective of the amount of resources that a local authority would have. So I think the big funders, you know, Historic Environment Scotland, the National Lottery, they're going to want their money to be more effective. They want to be coming in later and for a smaller percentage than they maybe have in the past. And I think the more you can build that case before you go to them, the better. But don't put it off indefinitely, and don't be scared of getting a rejection. Most of our projects get a rejection at the first time of asking, and often it has the best outcome, which is about strengthening and refining and improving that proposition. I hope, Lydia, that's a decent enough answer for you. There's no definitive point to go for it, but I would build as many smaller funds as you can before going to the big one. Anything you'd add there, Sarah?
I think, yeah, absolutely what you said. I think also, again, chat to people who've done it before, chat to people who've done it recently and find out what they've put into their application. Also, when you're putting in something like an expression of interest to the National Lottery, a number of our groups are getting knocked back on the first go, and then they're getting it on the second time and being invited to apply. Well, that feedback that you're getting on the first knockback is vital and really helpful. You're also letting the funders know about the project that's upcoming. And that kind of helps them to get on board and keep an eye out for it and get excited about the fact that, wow, there's this group who want to do this amazing thing. And it's great to kind of build that profile. It's always good to chat with the funders. All the funders we work with say, give us a call, send us an email, discuss it with us, because we want to know about what you're doing, and give us the opportunity to feed back a bit, because they don't want you to do, whopping great applications without getting their input first, because they might say, oh, that's really not a priority and that's not what we would fund. So yeah, do make sure that you contact them when there's the opportunity to do so.
Ailsa, do you have any funding experiences that you're comfortable sharing with us?
I would say with your community consultation, make sure you're getting the depth of it as well, because you might have right now lots of people saying, yeah, I want to go to the cinema on my doorstep, but why aren't they going somewhere else? Is there something specific you can do there? You know, are they excluded from going somewhere because they can't travel there? Are there going to be other benefits of that building to them? You know, kind of that they can use it for other things as well as cinema. I worked on the Campbelltown Picture House redevelopment, and part of that was about saying, well, actually, if we do this, then the community now have a conference room in the cinema, and they have conferencing facilities which they didn't have available in Campbelltown then. So it's not just as straightforward as saying, what do you want and is it a cinema? It's what would you actually do with it when we get it? And why, you know, it's the so what question, isn't it? And especially somewhere like Glasgow, which is quite well served with cinema provision. It's like, what's the difference going to be here?
Yeah.
I would just add quickly to that, just think outside your building a bit as well. I mean, we know reusing the building you've got is the most sustainable thing that we can do. That's fantastic. But also, are there any green spaces around? Are there any other activities you could do outside and nearby that would be beneficial to people? We know the popularity of growing programs and training and skills. So just think of anything like that. That's still part of everything you're doing. It doesn't have to be physically in the building for every project.
And I think maybe my final comment on that one around local support is who isn't there? Who isn't already using your building? Which groups are not already supporting what you're doing, and what are the barriers to them getting involved? Because ultimately that's what a lot of funders are looking for, whether it's heritage funding or lottery funding. It's about bringing people together. It's about people learning new skills. So it's really important that you've got a good handle on what the barriers to being involved in your project are. Okay, I don't think we've got any questions in the chat box, and we are now over our time. So it just falls to me really to thank Sarah and Ailsa for joining us this afternoon and sharing their experiences on this subject. And unless you guys have got any further questions for each other, maybe? No?
I could talk to Ailsa for hours. I think we should have a coffee after.
I think so.
Okay, well, I'll just say thanks once again to our funders, Glasgow City Council, and our sponsors, including Arlington Baths and the various architectural firms and construction consultants there. If you would like to support Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival and to keep it free for future visits, please do support us and donate to the Trust just by texting Doors Open to 785 to donate £5. And yeah, finally, just thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. And I think this session will be recorded, or it has been recorded, and it will be available on the YouTube channel fairly soon. So thank you once again to Sarah and Ailsa. Goodbye.
Thanks, bye.